A very warm welcome to everyone to ACOP 2022. I am Katigan, a psychologist with the Home Team Behavioral Sciences Center, and I will be the facilitator for this session on cybercrimes. To our colleagues from Singapore or the region, we hope that you managed to grab a bite or a drink during a tea break. And for friends joining us from other parts of the world, we are glad to have you with us and hope you are excited for the lineup of presentations that we have. But before that, let us warm up with a short energizer. Could I get all colleagues and delegates to type in the chat? Where are you tuning into ACOP 2022 from? So this year's hybrid ACOP allows us to see many participants attend the conference from across the world. Let us know where you are tuning in from by typing your answers in the chat. Thank you everyone for your active participation. So once again, may I get all colleagues and delegates to type in the chat, where are you tuning into ACOP 2022 from? Okay, so we do see responses coming in. We see Singapore. Thanks again for joining us, colleagues. We do see Philippines. Thank you for the responses coming in. Are there any more responses coming in? So once again, where are you tuning into ACOP 2022 from? For our colleagues and delegates in Singapore, I do imagine you will either be from your workplaces or from home. Whereas from colleagues or from delegates joining us overseas, you may be from all over the world. So we do see colleagues from Australia as well. Okay, let's see if there's any more responses. Okay, so if not, thank you so much for your active participation and for using the chat function. So just a gentle reminder to all our colleagues and delegates with us on this session, not to record or reproduce any content from the presentation that will be screened onto public platforms, for instance, social media. Nevertheless, for non-sensitive content, feel free to share your experiences and thoughts on social media, and don't forget to hashtag ACOP 2022. Please do note that you can also find the recordings of the conference presentations on this platform after the day's proceedings have ended. And if you have any questions with regards to presentations, do include them in the Q&A function. So for the cybercrime presentation track today, we have a total of 3 presentations, with each presentation lasting a total of 15 minutes. Today, 2 of our speakers are live with us, and we'll be taking questions from the audience in the combined 10-minute Q&A portion at the end of this track. Unfortunately, Mr. Andy Chua is unable to join us today, and if you have any questions regarding his presentation, please feel free to contact Mr. Andy directly via his email address provided. Again, we strongly encourage all attendees to post any questions or comments that you may have for the presentations via the Q&A tab. So without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce the first presenter for this session. So Dr. Chung Kai Lee joined the University of Reading in 2017 after completing her PhD from the Edinburgh Napier University. Dr. Kai Lee's main research interest lies in psychopathology and individual differences, where her PhD thesis focused on the dark triad. Her current research area covers investigative interviewing as well as interpersonal violence, which involves working closely with the police force and abuse victims. So generally, the extant literature in developmental psychology highlights the importance of evidence-based interviewing to ensure the reliability of child witness statements. Additionally, where possible, criminal justice system professionals working with child witnesses should be equipped with basic knowledge of memory functioning, as erroneous beliefs may impact how alleged abuse cases are managed. Today, Dr. Kylie will be sharing with us her research on beliefs about children's memory and child investigative interviewing practices among police officers and victim care officers in Malaysia. We will now start the presentation by Dr. Kylie, please.
Hi, my name is Kylie, and I am currently a lecturer in psychology at the University of Reading, Malaysia. In this presentation, I will discuss a piece of research I have conducted with two lovely colleagues, Yiling from the Royal Malaysia Police and Nail from Maastricht University and Universitas Indonesia. This project is titled Police's and Victim Care Officers' Beliefs about Memory and Investigative Interviewing with Children. Child protection professionals, typically police investigators, deal with many complex cases of alleged child abuse on a daily basis. In many cases, there is no corroborating evidence other than the child witness themselves, and therefore, the investigative outcomes rely heavily on the child's recollection. Now, we know that investigative interviews are not easy to conduct, but interviewing children can be considered an even more challenging task, given that research has shown children to be more susceptible to suggestive influence, and this can lead to memory errors. If investigative interviews are not conducted well, the affected children may be put through prolonged legal proceedings, only later to have their interviews testified by experts as inconclusive. Inaccurate information that is obtained through the interviews can also lead to false accusations. The worst scenario is that the abuser may run free, giving them a chance to exploit other children. Through many years of research, we now have a better understanding of children's cognitive development, particularly in memory. And this knowledge has shaped best practice recommendations for child investigative interviews. It is extremely important for interviewers to adhere to evidence-based protocol to prevent the negative consequences that I've just mentioned. While there are evidence-based guidelines, in reality, many practitioners still tend to rely on techniques that are based on pre-existing intuitive beliefs about memory functioning and investigative interviewing. And these beliefs may not necessarily be in line with current scientific research. In the current literature, many studies have been conducted in the western part of the world. For example, Melinda and colleagues surveyed judges, police detectives, mental health professionals, prosecutors, and defense lawyers in Norway, and found that defense lawyers were the least likely to believe children are credible and better witnesses than adults. In contrast, psychiatrists and police detectives were the most positive about children's capacities as credible witnesses. In the United States, Buck and colleagues found that jury-eligible students had poorer knowledge of child interviewing research compared with forensic interviewers, public defenders, and forensic psychologists. Only a couple of similar studies have been conducted in the East. Both studies found similar findings in that child protection professionals demonstrated knowledge of eyewitness memory that is less than optimal. So what are the implications of these research findings? Well, if children are seen to be less competent than adults in remembering incidents they have experienced, this perceived lack of credibility and reliability may lead to their testimony being given less weight in court. Erroneous beliefs may negatively impact the behavior of professionals and have a profound influence on the outcome of an investigation. For instance, an investigative interviewer who does not believe that memory can be influenced by suggestions may be less likely to take precautions with wording when interviewing a child. Also, psychological expert witnesses who are summoned to court to give an expert opinion may be basing their recommendations on personal beliefs as opposed to up-to-date scientific knowledge. So in our study, we examined beliefs about children's memory and child investigative interviewing practices among police officers and victim care officers in Malaysia. In Malaysia, police investigators who investigate child abuse cases served the Royal Malaysia Police in a division known as D11 under the Criminal Investigation Department. A number of these investigating officers are trained to conduct interviews with children. There are also a group of victim care officers, some of which who are registered counselors, who work under the Criminal Investigation Department, supporting victims of abuse and their families. Now, in light of the data found in other parts of the world, we expected in our study that inaccurate beliefs about children's memory functioning would be prominent among these child protection professionals. We also expected that the interview practiced by police interviewers would not be in accordance with evidence-based protocols that are internationally endorsed. We administered a questionnaire study. There were two sections to this study. In section 1, 50 police officers and 23 victim care officers completed a 20-statement survey in order for us to assess beliefs and knowledge on memory functioning and child investigative interviewing. They indicated whether they thought the statements were true or false, or they could also select the don't know option. Section 2 has a case vignette in which a 7-year-old girl was allegedly abused sexually by her stepfather. This section was completed only by the police officer sample. The police were asked to prepare a list of questions related to the alleged abuse in order to know what happened. They were asked to write down the questions in order and to formulate the questions in a direct sentences format. In this slide, you can see a table that contains the 20 statements to assess knowledge on memory functioning and child investigative interviewing. All statements except for statement number 13 are false, according to broad scientific consensus. This table shows the percentage of professionals who provided answers that are in line with current memory research, in other words, correct answers. We ran an independent samples t-test, and there was no difference in overall performance between the police and victim care officer groups. Multiple regression analysis also revealed that age, length of service, as well as the number of interviews conducted by the police did not influence the performance of each group. We ran a Fisher's exact test to see if there were significant differences between the two groups in how they performed on each item. There were two items in which they differed significantly. Item number 3, it is impossible for a child to develop false memory of child sexual abuse. For this statement, more victim care officers made mistakes. For item number 6, the more confidence a person has when reporting a memory, the more likely it is that the memory is accurate. More victim care officers answered this correctly. Participants were also asked to indicate how good their understanding of child investigative interviews is, and how satisfied they are with the outcome of their work with children interviewed as alleged victims or witnesses. We ran a Mann-Whitney U-test and found that knowledge and satisfaction ratings for victim care officers were significantly higher than those of police officers. In section 2, police officers were asked to list the questions they would ask an alleged child abuse victim. These questions were coded with reference to the NICHD manual on utterance types. Responses were first categorized into non-substantive and substantive utterances. The substantive utterances were then coded into 4 different question types. Invitations, for example, tell me everything that happened. Directives, these are mostly WH questions, for example, where did it happen? Option posing, these are like yes-no questions or forced choice questions, for example, did it hurt? And suggestive questions, anything that implies a particular response is expected can be coded as suggestive. A question that contains material that was not disclosed at the beginning, so for example, who did something bad to you? Or if it sounds risky, do you understand what rape means, for example? These are also coded as suggestive. The first author, which is myself, and a research assistant, performed the coding independently. and we found a good inter-rater agreement with a Cohen's kappa of 0.75. Any disagreement that we had were resolved through discussions with the third author, which is Nail, and he is also trained in the use of NICHD protocol. To summarize the findings, as expected, child protection professionals who deal with child abuse cases did not fully endorse beliefs that are consistent with the up-to-date scientific literature. The majority of participants provided accurate responses to only 2 items out of the 20. They accurately believe that children's memories are more susceptible to suggestions than adults, and they also accurately believe that a witness may mention details of an event at a later time, and that does not necessarily indicate memory inaccuracy. So our findings show that the expertise of professionals working in the criminal justice system is not always evidence-informed. However, we also acknowledge that police practitioners have an extremely high workload, and also they are not forensic experts who are expected to engage in the current literature. Victim care officers in Malaysia typically have some background in psychology, but as generalists, they also cover a wide range of victim services within their job scope. This means that these practitioners simply do not have the capacity to engage in specialist training to enable them to be more competent in their jobs. However, we're pleased to see from Section 2 of the study that police officers had attempts to engage in positive interview practices. There was evidence of rapport building, and the proportion of suggestive type questions was also relatively low, even though ideally, interviewers would use more general invitations and open prompt questions. But a more concerning finding is the mention of props or visual aids, such as dolls and drawing in the planned interviews. Some studies have raised concerns about the use of dolls. It has been argued that dolls can lead to more suggestive and longer questions by the interviewer, but also less detailed responses from children. The general consensus among child interview experts at the moment is that props should be avoided. The key takeaway from our study is that knowledge and skills gap can be rectified through training, supervision, evaluation and feedback, as well as continuing education. That being said, a common issue around the world is that research-based knowledge does not always transfer to work in the field. According to Griffiths and Milne, several factors have to be in place in order to ensure that organizations apply the best evidence in policing in general. 2 factors are particularly relevant to the context in Malaysia. Leadership that encourages institutional culture or change towards evidence-based approaches, as well as being open-minded to effective techniques. With more awareness and continued training, and positive investigation outcomes as a result, we hope that this would motivate investigators to be more reflective upon their own methods. In conclusion, our findings from this study serve as a foundation for intervention and policy making in a country that is seeking to move forward. If you would like to know more about this study, here's a link for your reference. We would also like to say a big thank you to D11 of the Royal Malaysia Police for their support. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Kylie, for the insightful sharing. I believe many in the audience have benefited from your sharing, particularly on evidence-based investigative interviewing of young witnesses, and what are some best practices when it comes to questioning them in investigative interviews. So, the next presentation we have is by Mr. Andy Chua. Mr. Andy is an experienced brain protection professional, having started his career in the Singapore Police Force, where he served 17 years in various roles. He left SPF in 2012 and had stints in similar roles at companies such as Microsoft and Under Armour. He is currently the head of intellectual property protection and law enforcement in the Lazada Group, where he oversees Southeast Asia's brand protection program and law enforcement partnership and collaboration. So e-commerce scams have consistently been one of the top scams in Singapore. In this presentation, Mr. Andy explains the 3 most observed e-commerce scams and highlights the ruses which scammers typically use. The presentation aims to highlight the important collaborations between e-commerce platforms and government regulators in the light of constantly evolving scams. So without further ado, we will begin the presentation. Mr. Andy, please.
Hi everybody, my name is Andy. I lead the intellectual property protection and law enforcement team for Lazada Group. I'm glad to be here today to share with everyone on what Lazada is doing around combating scams. And the topic of my presentation today is Lazada's war against e-commerce scams and the significance of private-public partnerships. I'd like to share with everyone a little bit about Lazada's mission and vision. Lazada's mission is all about accelerating progress in Southeast Asia through e-commerce and technology. And our vision is basically to serve 300 million consumers, be the best at enabling brands and sellers to digitalize their commerce. And we hope to achieve like US 1 billion GMV over the coming years. Now, we are still a relatively very young company. If you look at it, Lazada was only formed in 2012. It started from a startup company called Rocket Internet. And along the years, Lazada received a fair bit of investments from stakeholders. But what was really significant was that in 2016, Alibaba Group actually bought a controlling stake of Lazada. And along the way, Lazada also made some of its own acquisitions, right? And most of you might also know that RedMart, who Lazada bought over as well, is part of our ecosystem. So RedMart is basically an online grocery store that you can actually buy your groceries from. We just recently celebrated our 10th anniversary. So again, we are relatively a very new company as compared to the other e-commerce or tech companies around Southeast Asia. Now, how do we tackle scams? Some of you may ask, or how are we actually dealing with scams that we face with on almost a constant basis, right? First and foremost, we rely on what we call the four pillars. Now, first and foremost is technology-driven governance. So we leverage on Alibaba technology in preventing scams from happening. We also rely a lot on data analytics. So what we do is we use data to try and identify sellers that have the potential to commit scams on our platform. We also collaborate very closely with law enforcement to bring criminal syndicates, for example, to task whenever they try and commit scams. Most of you may also be aware that we do a lot of outreach and education. And again, this is one opportunity for us to do some outreach in terms of helping educate the public, right, about how to stay safe while doing e-commerce transactions. Now, I'd like to run through a few examples of the most common scams we see on basic e-commerce platforms. A lot of you may be familiar with this. For example, you would receive SMSs or WhatsApp messages even of what we call job scams. So what these scammers usually do is that they will send you a message, as you can see from the presentation screen. You will receive messages promising you of high salary for minimal effort. So these are basically the characteristics of a job scam. First and foremost, they promise a very high-paying job with minimal effort. Or sometimes they may divert you to a third-party platform to register to basically do the job. They will basically bait you with telling you to do certain tasks, for example, going to the e-commerce website's app to add a certain product into cart, take a screenshot of that, and then you get a commission, right? That is to basically bait you to continue doing that. So, you know, and then bait you with a small transfer of money. Now, what we have done, basically in our part, playing our part in educating the public, is that we've done again a lot of outreach. For example, we've collaborated with the National Crime Prevention Council, NCPC, on YouTube video educating the public, right, that Lazada will not basically recruit you for a part-time job through SMS, right? Neither would we encourage you to do a funds transfer to a bank account that is unknown to you. Now, the other scam that we commonly see is what we call phishing scams. Now, this is where the scammers try and trick you into revealing your personal details. Now, I know Singapore has basically stopped using the plus 65 or the prefix plus numbers already, but some scammers, you know, still try and do this, right? And then people still get scammed doing this kind of phishing calls. So what happened is that you would get a phone call. For example, someone would call you and say that they have basically a service or to offer, or you know, you have purchased something from Lazada, and they ask you, did you buy this expensive watch, for example? If you've not, don't worry, we'll help you cancel. I actually have an example which I will play to everyone later on, so that you get to understand this sort of scams better. So what should you do when you encounter this kind of scams, right? Unknown folks, all pretending to be staff from Lazada, trying to call you to get you to reveal your personal details. Well, first and foremost, you should basically be wary whenever you receive a plus 65 or plus prefix number, because that generally is an indication or a red flag. Never give out your personal details. Lazada will never ask you to reveal your personal details over such calls as well. Now I'm going to run through a real life example with everyone so that you get to understand this a little bit better. If you can listen to the audio, that would be awesome. So as you can see from this example, the scammer called the victim, pretending to be from Lazada, and telling the victim that, look, you purchased something expensive. Did you make a purchase? And then when the victim say no, and then the scammer will say, don't worry, sir, you know, let me try and cancel this order from you. And that's when they try and solicit that information from the victim. The other scam that most commonly happen on e-commerce platform is what we call fulfillment scam. So for example, you buy a phone and what you receive is not the phone, but something else. Or it could be an empty parcel, or it could be a rock in the parcel as well. Now, what should you do when you happen to encounter this sort of scams? We would advise victims to basically report it to the platform, report it to the authorities, and of course, immediately inform your bank about the transaction. So Lazada has also worked very closely with its stakeholders, right? And as you may be aware, we have been working very closely with law enforcement in and around the region. We've also been very active about creating awareness through the media. We've gone on social media, we've gone on mainstream TV and newspapers as well to try and do this sort of engagements with the public in collaboration with law enforcement and some of our external stakeholders. Now, our hard work has basically sort of paid off, because I think, again, most of you may be aware of this as well. The recent crime stats released by SPF, in 2020, we were basically around the top 5 of platforms that has the most scams. But in 2021, we were basically not reflected as the top 5 e-commerce platforms where scams happen. We've also been called out for our efforts on a few occasions, both by the Minister, Desmond Tan, as well as receiving accolades and awards from our partners like SPF and other stakeholders. We've also been mentioned on a number of articles that we are one of the safest e-commerce platforms in the region. We continue to do awareness because I think it's important. And we will continue to basically work with our stakeholders and partners, for example, to ensure that our users stay safe while transacting on our platform. Scammers will come up with new ways of trying to cheat victims, right? So we really need to be very careful about it. And we really need to remind everybody that Lazada will never ask you for personal details like OTP, your CVV, or your bank account details. Now, it's also important for people in general to understand that Lazada will never ask you to transact outside of the platform. Neither will we ask you to transfer money to a bank account number that you do not know of. And it's also important that we collaborate with our stakeholders like law enforcement and other agencies, right? Because collaboration is very important as scams get more and more complicated and scammers become more creative around how to scam victims. Now, with this, I want to thank everybody for your time and inviting me to speak today. Thank you very much.
And police intelligence through offense research and profiling projects such as well as direct consultations with units in high-profile ongoing cases. Ms. Caroline oversees the crime-related areas of the work. So, loan scams are a form of advanced fee fraud scams where victims are persuaded to transfer their monies in the hope of obtaining a larger loan amount. In Singapore, loan scams have resulted in victims. Okay, so sorry, let me restart this. So the final presentation for this track is by Ms. Caroline Miser. Ms. Caroline Miser is a principal psychologist in the Operations and Forensic Psychology branch of the Police Psychological Services Division. The Police Psychological Services Divisions support police operations, crime investigations, victim support, and police intelligence through offense research and profiling projects, as well as direct consultations with units in high-profile ongoing cases. Ms. Caroline oversees the crime-related areas of the work. So loan scams are a form of advanced fee fraud scams where victims are persuaded to transfer their monies in the hopes of obtaining a larger loan amount. In Singapore, loan scams have resulted in victim monetary losses of 10.6 million in the first half of 2021. In today's presentation, Ms. Caroline focuses on loan scams in Singapore and explores the process of how these scams work, the psychological mechanisms that operate in recruiting and inducing victims to comply to the scammer's requests, and the profile of victims who fall prey to such scams. So we will now start the presentation by Ms. Caroline, please.
Good afternoon, my name is Caroline. I'm a principal psychologist at the Police Psychological Services Department, Singapore Police Force. Today I'll be sharing on the behavioral analysis of victims of loan scams. And this will be the scope of my presentation today. So just some background to loan scams. Now, scams are an international problem. People all over the world are being cheated out of millions of dollars. In Singapore, loan scams are one of the top 10 scams, and from a period of January to June 2021, loan scam was the top scam. There are two variants of loan scams. The first is a trial loan and the second is a direct loan. In a trial loan, what happens is the scammer offers a loan, deposits a small amount of money into the victim's account, and then asks for a larger sum of money to be transferred back as part of processing fee. In a direct loan, the scammer offers a loan that is very much lower than the current market interest rate, and very little documentation such as only your ID is needed. This is an example of a WhatsApp message of a loan scam. And I'll share a bit about the research question for this study. So we were interested why people fall for loan scams, and to that end, we looked at the quantitative and qualitative analysis of victim statement of facts as well as in-depth interviews. And the purpose of this study was really to look at how we can prevent people from falling prey to loan scams and propose, how to refine crime prevention messages. So for the literature review, we looked at three major areas. The first was cognitive biases, in particular optimism bias, sunk cost fallacy, and near miss bias, especially their application in loan scams. Compliance techniques or persuasion techniques. Of Cialdini's 7 techniques, these 4 techniques, authority, social proof, scarcity, behavioral commitment, weigh heavily in loan scams. We also looked at advance fee payment fraud scams internationally, and we looked at how the Singapore model compared to that. In the Singapore model, it is actually a combination model. It is the advance fee payment fraud at first, and that is combined with threat or coercion. So it's a 2-part model. So in terms of methodology of the study, we had 2 parts to the methodology. The first part was to look at the literature review and code the significant factors. So we coded and analyzed 293 statement of facts. The second part was to interview victims, and so using the factors that we found, we developed a semi-structured interview, and we did the interviewing for these victims. So to share on some of the findings of the study. So in terms of demographic findings, we found that victims tend to be male rather than female. Gender interaction with nationality was not significant. Victims tended to be more Singaporean than other nationalities, and Singaporean victims tended to be either Chinese or Malay, about equal proportion than other ethnic groups. Victims who were foreigners tended more to be Malaysians than other nationalities. In terms of age, we find that it's a bimodal curve with 25 and 45 being the peaks. We found that age and nationality was significant, so that if you were more than 38 years old, you tended to be Singaporean. Age by race was also significant, and we found that there were more Chinese victims in the age group of 28 to 37. In terms of occupation, age was also significant, and we found that large majority of victims who were under the age of 27 tended to be NS men or students. In terms of occupation, we find that 59% of the victims in our sample were white-collar executives and 40% were blue-collar workers. Victims tended to take about 6.5 days to report after the first transfer of money, and this is very significant because the longer you wait to report, the harder it is to freeze money or do any kind of investigation to track where the money went. Victims made at least 2 transactions, 1 to 4 on average, and victims tended to transfer minimally 1.5 to 300% of the original loan they asked for. If you're wondering, why 300% was transferred, well, it's mostly the victims who were coerced or threatened that transferred so much money. Singaporean victims, tended to be scammed by more money than foreign victims, and they were scammed about 2,000 more than foreign victims. No gender difference. Victims tended to stop transferring money when they did not receive the loan, or they were suspicious why they had to keep transferring to different accounts, or they did not have any more funds. So 19% of our victims were threatened in the sample, and they were threatened in terms of their safety or being embarrassed, telling people that they had taken a loan. 10% will harass, okay, either calls to the victim, calls to the workplace, calls to their spouses, and so on. Scammers tended to target victims through text messages or WhatsApp platforms, and then they would always ask the victims to switch platforms to evade detection. The most common platform they would switch to is WhatsApp. Follow-up for the victim will occur within the day, and usually within 24 hours. The scammers will always say, perform the loan transfers and everything before 6 p.m., before the office close. Okay. The first transfer from the victim was usually about 20% or slightly less than the original amount asked for. And in terms of the persuasion techniques, these three persuasion techniques are the heaviest used. Okay, authority followed by commitment followed by scarcity in our sample. So this is a brief summary of the flow of scam. In the first stage, okay, the advertising stage, the scammer will always have a very legitimate looking website, online form, a very legitimate looking business logo, a lot of business jargon, or they will send messages via SMS or Facebook or WhatsApp. And this makes use of the principle of authority because, you know, they are trying to create a sense of legitimacy through the websites and the form. Usually on the form or in the SMS, it will be, very attractive interest rates for limited time only. Please get your loan within these few days, that kind of thing. So it creates a sense of urgency and scarcity. A lot of the victims tell us that when they come across these websites or they receive these messages, they do not immediately think that there's something wrong and there are any red flags. And this shows that a lot of them have this optimism bias where they don't believe that they will be victims of scams. So in the follow-up stage, okay, scammers would try to mimic a banking process by asking victims for various financial documents like CPF, income tax, so on and so forth. And this creates a sense of authority and legitimacy that, they are really in the banking money lending business. The scammer will also mention that, he needs to check with the supervisor if the loan is possible given your financial documents, and the supervisor would then, chat with the victim to talk about the loan process, and this gives the idea of social proof. It leverages very much on that. So in the offer stage, the scammer will say that the loan is too high, and they will tell the victim, okay, let me just give you a slightly lower amount, but this is just for you, or this is just for a limited time. And this leverages again on scarcity or urgency. Another variant is where the scammer will say okay to the amount, but says that, because of your not so good banking credentials, okay, this is only out of goodwill. And that leverages on reciprocity, because if somebody does something good for you, you'll try to do something good for that person. And so the victims are very willing to then quickly transfer money for processing fee and so on. The scammer will also sometimes, okay, deposit a small amount of money in the trial loan variant as goodwill or promotional offer, and then they will later ask for the victim to transfer back more money than what was initially deposited. That makes use of the principle of commitment, because the victim had already opened an account, had already received the money, had already transferred money, so the victim is more likely to follow through on various transfers later. Now, in the demand stage, the scammer will ask for various money transfers to be made, citing a variety of reasons like GST, admin fee, upfront payment, and so on. And they would issue very legitimate looking invoices, such as invoices that spoof MAS logo, fake business receipt with reference number, and so on. And they would cycle this through this whole process, issuing an invoice, asking for money, issuing for invoice, asking for money, and keep asking the victims to transfer money. This makes use of a variety of principles, okay? In the money transfer, because of the invoices and how legitimate they look, victims really believe that these are true invoices, and that leverages on the principle of authority. The scammers will always tell the victims that we must complete the transaction quickly. I send you the invoice, pay me quickly. We must complete by the end of the day. And that makes use of the principle of scarcity. The victims themselves, okay, because they had already started this whole process and they are more likely to try and see it through, and that leverages on the principle of commitment. Victims also tell us that, when they look at these invoices that are repeatedly sent to them by the scammers, they never thought that, this would be a scam. They never thought that they would be so unlucky. And this operates on the optimism bias. The scammers also, spend some time talking and convincing the victims. They always tell the victims that, you're almost there, just one more transfer, and that makes use of the near miss effect. They also tell the victims that, you have already given so much money, what's a little bit more, and that makes use of the sunk cost. At this stage, threat, the scammers would threaten the victims when they refuse to pay any more, whether it's because they don't have any more money left, or they just realize that something might be wrong. Threats are usually in the form of videos or pictures of houses that have been burned or splashed with paint. As you can see, one of the victims told us that the scammer had sent so many videos of houses that he had burned. She was really very frightened for her family, and so she kept transferring money. Okay, at this stage, the victims usually realize, they have been scammed because they have transferred a large amount of money, but never received any loan, or they have been threatened. When victims realize that it's a scam, most of the time they will just quickly try to close their accounts or contact the bank to freeze the money, and then they will make a report to the police. Unfortunately, a lot of times, like I said, it takes about 6.5 days, and that becomes very difficult in terms of freezing the money. So in view of time, I'm just going to share very briefly on the crime prevention strategies. This is not exhaustive, but it is in line with our findings. So in terms of crime prevention, because we found that there were more males than females, we want to target sites that have a strong male following. In terms of race and nationality, we want to have crime prevention messages in Mandarin, especially on platforms that reach both Singaporeans and Malaysians. In terms of age group, we want to have crime prevention messages or efforts that are very tailored for these age groups, like students, NS boys, versus people in their 40s. In terms of occupation, because white collar is about 60% and blue collar is about 40%, we want to have very specific outreach efforts that tailor platforms that these people might be looking at. Because it's about 6.5 days on average that people take to report what has happened, we really want to have timely crime prevention messages at the platforms that scammers are using. So, for example, Facebook, for example, online sites where people key in, loans. We want to have pop-up messages, and we want to talk about the process of scam and how important it is to recognize the signs of scams. Transactions, because a lot of people don't really understand how financial transactions are supposed to occur. Like, you cannot have licensed money lenders soliciting over the SMS. Okay, so these things need to be made known and aware to the members of public. The loan process especially, okay, because victims were made to pay for GST, and there's no such thing in loans. So things like that need to be made known to the wider public. Because scammers use a lot of persuasion techniques, okay, in the scam process, we also want to use the same persuasion techniques in our crime messaging. So for example, in terms of optimism bias, we want to use very relatable, tailored, personalized stories of victims. Anybody can be scammed, even victims, for example, who are in the banking industry. Just a bit about the limitations of the study. We really lack a lot of data fields to perform more in-depth analysis. I really want to find out cognitive processes, but these are not captured in the statement of facts. The small sample size for in-depth interview was also a problem because a lot of victims did not agree to the being interviewed. And so that's the end of my presentation. I welcome any questions, and you can email me for more information about the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Caroline, for the thought-provoking presentation. The presentation has shed light on how loan scams work, the profile of victims who fall prey to such scams, and would definitely be useful for further scam prevention efforts. We have now come to the end of the entire series of presentations for this track, And we'll now be moving on to the live Q&A segment for the remaining duration of the track. We'd also like to invite the presenters into the virtual space for the Q&A segment. So once again, a gentle reminder to all delegates that Mr. Andy is unable to join us for the Q&A session. And if you might have any questions specific to his presentation, feel free to contact Mr. Andy directly by his email address provided. So Dr. Kylie and Ms. Caroline, thank you for joining the Q&A segment live today. I do believe there was a lot of interesting content that you've shared, and maybe let us give a few seconds for our delegates to think through and come in with their questions. And maybe while waiting for the delegates to think through of their questions and post some of their questions that they have, maybe I could start the ball rolling with a question on my own. So Dr. Kylie, you spoke about investigation officers' beliefs and practices, right? And Ms. Caroline, you also spoke about loan scams and why do victims fall prey to these scams. So for both presentations, when we do speak about people's beliefs and awareness, there seems to be this gap in terms of the knowledge or belief a person has, be it a victim or a police officer, and the practice or the behaviors that they then take. So what are your thoughts on this view, or how can this then be prevented?
Kylie, you want to go ahead?
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Yes, the idea of I think one of the things as an academic, I feel that one of the things that we do struggle with is to, when you do research, to bring that knowledge and that research findings, that science to be put into place when it comes to practitioners. And I think based on my own experiences working in the field, I think practitioners are very often very open-minded into learning and getting more information from us. And I think it's just sometimes the lack of collaboration and the lack of working together is one of the reasons why we see a lot of findings that we have from research in terms of people's beliefs, people's perception. But there's always this misconception or myths that people believe that is pretty much due to lack of education and lack of public engagement. So I think nowadays, as an academic, again, I think we're better at doing this, getting more into the field, knowing that a lot of our research are funded by taxpayers, and therefore going out there, one of these platforms like conferences, telling people about the work we do, and also making it really accessible. I think it's one of the very key things, making our work accessible so that people can understand what are the challenges that we face when we talk about psychological mechanisms, and therefore work together to prevent some of these mishaps from happening, be it scams or, in our case, usually sexual abuse crimes and even practice that are not scientifically based and so on. So my view is that always working together, collaboration, and just being very open to working together is one of my what I would encourage a lot of academics to be doing, especially early career researchers.
Thank you, Dr. Kylie. Ms. Caroline, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think for me pertaining to more like scam victims, I think there's a intention to action kind of gap that you're talking about. Yeah. And then so this, we know that, this action and intention gap theory has been studied quite often. For us, right, really when we look at the various scam studies that we've done, I've presented on loan scams now, but we have done about 5 or 6, 7 different types of scam studies, and each study in depth specifically. We find that almost 100%, really 90+% of the victims that we've talked to all have a cognitive bias called optimism gap bias. Okay, they really, when we ask them, have you seen the posters? Have you seen the adverts? Do you know the scam signs that we put out? And they all say yes. But really, they all always think that's not me. It won't happen to me. I'm not so unlucky, and in the Singaporean context, they always say, I'm not so sway, But yet, it really does happen to anybody. And we've had people who are even in like the banking industry, and the anti-fraud division that fall prey to scams. And these people, actually, it might be even worse because, they are thinking that I know so much, I really would not fall prey to scams. So that actually that optimism bias is very real. very robust across the different scam studies and almost in all the victims. And really sometimes with the additional education background or the knowledge in the field, like people who are very good at IT, people who are in the business sector, they might be even a little bit more higher on the optimism bias, because they think that, I actually have all this knowledge, I have all these skills. And when the scammer then introduces a lot of jargon, like in investment scams, they have a lot of investment jargon. There's people who with a lot of investment and banking experience, they say, yeah, I've heard these terms. Yeah, I know about these different kind of platforms or cryptocurrency and things like that. And that actually makes the scam even more believable in that sense, and then so with this optimism bias always operating, it's very hard for people to take action, even though they are aware. And then so one of the things that we really try to do in our outreach is to tell people that anybody can fall prey to scams. Always be very hyper vigilant in that sense, not really hyper, but really vigilant. Pay attention to the scam signs, and don't have this belief that it might not happen to me. Always check, always verify. We always tell people, please do an independent verification. Go to the website, go to the agency, go to another source and look and see whether this information you're being given is true. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, both Ms. Caroline as well as Dr. Kylie. So if I could just summarize what you both shared, it really sounds like as humans, be it investigation officers or victims, we do seem to have this, like what Ms. Caroline mentioned, this cognitive bias, right? We do believe we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. So I think what it really highlights is really the human bias that we have, and also the importance and the need for collaborations between researchers and government policies as well. So thank you so much for that. As of now, it appears that there are no questions from our delegates, and I also have noticed it is about time to wrap up today's session. But if delegates wish, you may always approach our respective presenters personally after this session or during the tea breaks if you have any further burning questions. So with that, thank you all. We have come to the end of our Q&A session for today. I would like to invite everyone to join me in thanking our presenters for sharing with us their research and perspectives. I'm sure all of us have gained much insight into cybercrimes during this session. So following this series of presentations, we can look forward to the next segment of the ACOP program, where we are pleased to have a few speakers discuss the topic of sexual offending as part of an ACOP special session. So I will now hand over the time to Yasmin, who will be facilitating the special session. Thank you very much.